Hey, tonight, we're diving deep into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with its heroic, sharpshooting cowboys and clear-cut dramatic showdowns, but the often gritty, incredibly dangerous reality where your survival was never, ever guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, that you've got what it takes. But trust me, there's a very good reason they called it wild. In fact, imagine this for a moment, or else congratulations. You've just woken up. It's sometime in the American Wild West, perhaps the 1870s. If you find yourself enjoying these journeys into the stark realities of the past, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider a quick like, or even a subscribe for more explorations like this one. It truly helps more than you know. I'm always so curious to hear where you all are listening from, so if you feel inclined, drop a comment down below with your location, maybe what time it is there. It's wonderful seeing our little global community connect through these shared stories of history. Now, as we prepare to truly step into this challenging world, I invite you to find your comfortable position. Dim the lights a little, lower, if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, gentle background hum or draw a favorite blanket a bit closer, creating your own small haven of comfort. Let your body begin to relax. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are going to explore, in quiet detail, just why you and why any of us really might not survive even a single grueling day in the untamed American frontier. The good news, as you lie there, wherever your imagined self has landed, you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand, a time and place that still echoes with myth and adventure. The bad news, your chances of survival by modern standards have just dropped dramatically. The very first challenge might hit you before you even fully open your eyes to this new old world. It isn't a sound, nor a sight, but a smell, and likely not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, not the clean scent of pine or damp earth after rain. Though you'd be met with something far more pungent, an almost overwhelming miasma, perhaps the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, of animal droppings from nearby livestock, and what might quite possibly be the faint, unwelcome undercurrent of raw sewage or refuse hanging heavy in the still morning air. You see, bathing as you, and I understand it, wasn't exactly a daily priority or even a weekly one for many in the Wild West. Most settlers, trappers, or miners might have considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that, in some cases, might be generous. Some accounts suggest individuals went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, you understand, was an incredibly precious resource out here, often scarce and needing to be hauled over considerable distances. Using it to clean your entire body often seemed deeply wasteful when every drop was needed for drinking, for cooking, for the survival of your animals. This assault on your senses, this immediate olfactory shock, is just the first whisper of how profoundly different, how fundamentally alien this world is compared to the one you left behind. Picture your own familiar morning routine. For a moment, perhaps the gentle chime of your phone easing you awake, the soft light filtering through your curtains, the effortless comfort of your bed. Now, you try to erase that. Imagine instead that biting chill of a prairie wind we've hinted at, finding its way through the thinnest of walls, or the stark, unsettling silence of an endless desert landscape stretching out in every direction, broken only by sounds you don't yet recognize. That is closer to your new reality. There is no running water at the turn of a tap, no instant light with the flick of a switch, no well-stocked pharmacy down the street for a headache, no grocery store brimming with an almost infinite variety of food. The American West, for all its romantic allure, was a place of profound daily grinding struggle. So, the core question we're exploring, the one that hangs in the air like that pungent morning smell, is this: what would it truly take to endure even a single day here? And why, for many of us, would that be a day too far? This profound difference, this chasm between then and now, is what we will explore together on our journey tonight. Our exploration will unfold like the day itself might have for someone living through it. We'll feel the morning's chill, not as a metaphor, but as a genuine, biting cold that seeps into your bones even before you've risen. From your rough bed, we'll listen for the sounds of a frontier awakening, sounds that are likely far removed from the urban hum or suburban quiet you're used to. We will trace the immense, often unrecorded human effort that went into the simplest acts of existence, finding or building a shelter that offered even minimal protection from the elements, sourcing water that wouldn't make you desperately ill and preparing food in a world where true abundance was a rare and precious thing. Our path will take us through the relentless toil that defined most people's daylight hours, whether in the fields, on the range, or within the confines of a primitive home. We'll gently consider the invisible threats that lurked everywhere, the diseases that swept through unprotected populations, the accidents that could incapacitate or kill far from any hope of medical aid. We will also touch upon the human landscape, the deep need for community versus the crushing weight of isolation, the search for small comforts and moments of solace in a life of unceasing hardship. And as darkness, inevitably, falls on our imagined day, we'll explore the unique fears and vulnerabilities that the night brought in such an untamed land. It is a journey of sensory immersion, of empathetic understanding designed not to shock, but to quietly reveal the immense resilience required merely to exist. So let your mind grow quiet now. Allow your body to relax completely, sinking deeper into your chosen comfort. And let's step softly together into this world of yesterday, beginning as all days must, and as our journey will, with the very first tentative and perhaps very harsh light. Having settled comfortably into our journey, let's first paint a broader picture, a gentle understanding of the world you've just stepped into, a world often pictured in vibrant colors, perhaps through the thrilling haze of adventure stories or epic films, but perhaps felt more keenly, more truly in its subtle, demanding tones. The American West that you've awoken in, primarily during the mid to late 19th century, let's say roughly from the 1840s through to the very cusp of the 1900s, was not one single, easily defined place. It was, instead, an immense and incredibly diverse tapestry of landscapes, each presenting its own unique set of challenges, its own distinct character that would shape the lives of those who ventured into it. Imagine, if you will, your gaze sweeping across the seemingly endless prairies of the Great Plains. Picture these vast grasslands stretching out before you like a slumbering, tawny ocean. The grasses rippling in a wind that often felt ceaseless, a wind that carried the scent of dry earth and distance. You might try to follow that horizon, a line that seems to never quite arrive. A profound, almost overwhelming horizontality that could make you feel incredibly small. A tiny speck in an enormous, indifferent world. The sounds here might be the whisper and sigh of that wind through the tall grasses, or sometimes a silence, so profound it feels like a presence in itself, a silence that stretches for miles. Or perhaps your mind drifts towards the formidable, silent majesty of the Rocky Mountains, their towering peaks often capped with snow, even in the warmer months, piercing a brilliant blue sky. Picture deep, shadowed valleys and densest dark forests of pine and fir, where the air grew thin and carried a perpetual, biting chill. The sounds here might be different. The distant roar of an unseen waterfall, the sudden crack of a falling rock echoing across a canyon, or again, that immense, watchful silence that often pervades such high, lonely places. The sheer scale of these mountains could inspire awe, but also a keen sense of your own insignificance against such ancient, stony giants. Then again, the West also held vast, arid, sun-baked deserts regions like the Mojave or the Great Basin. Here you can almost feel the dry, intense heat radiating upwards from the packed, cracked earth. Even in the early hours, you might see the shimmering dance of heat mirages in the distance, distorting the landscape into fantastical wavering shapes. The silence of an empty desert can be particularly unearthly, broken only by the faint, dry scuttling of some unseen desert creature or the sigh of that same ever-present wind, now perhaps carrying fine particles of sand that would find their way into everything, your clothes, your food, your eyes. Survival in these landscapes was a masterclass in understanding scarcity, in reading the subtle signs of hidden water, in enduring relentless exposure. This, then, was the varied stage, these prairies, mountains, and deserts, upon which the quiet, daily drama of existence played out for those who journeyed west. It's so easy for us looking back to see this era through that romanticized lens, focusing on the tales of heroic cowboys, daring gunfighters, and grand, sweeping adventures. And while elements of such stories certainly occurred, for the vast majority of ordinary people who made their way into these territories, the homesteaders seeking a small piece of land to call their own, the small-scale farmers hoping for a fertile patch, the miners driven by the desperate glimmer of gold or silver, and especially the women who so often carried the immense, unsung burden of establishing a home and raising a family in the raw wilderness. Life was far less about those bright, exciting moments of high drama. It was more often a far more muted reality, painted in the earth tones of daily existence, in the grays of hardship and the deep browns of unceasing, unglamorous labor. The feeling of this reality, if you could truly touch it, was often colder, grittier, more demanding than the legends might lead you to believe. The very concept of survival, as you or I might understand it today, perhaps overcoming a sudden short-term crisis, an accident or a natural disaster, would need to be fundamentally recalibrated in this world you've entered. For those who lived, then survival wasn't an event. It was the very fabric of every single Tuesday, every Wednesday, every day of the week. It was a constant, low-level, grinding effort against the relentless forces of the elements, against pervasive scarcity, against profound isolation, and against the ever-present possibility of illness or accident, far, far from any meaningful help or modern understanding of medicine. The basics that you rely on without a second thought, readily available. Clean water by turning a tap, a diverse supply of food at the local store, a warm, dry, and secure shelter from the storm, access to medical care when you are sick or injured. These were not givens. They were daily achievements, hard-won, often precarious, and never ever taken for granted. So as we delve deeper into your first imagined morning, try to hold this gentle understanding close. You are stepping into a world where the baseline of human existence is dramatically fundamentally different from your own. A world where the extraordinary effort required for what was considered ordinary life was simply the way things were. With this vast and varied stage now set in your mind, let's bring our focus much closer to the very first personal moments of your imagined day, as dawn tentatively breaks over this demanding landscape. As the first faint hint of dawn begins to penetrate the deep darkness that has held the land for many hours, imagine you stir. But this awakening is unlike any you know in your accustomed life. There is no gentle easing into the day, no soft, yielding mattress conforming to your shape in a climate-controlled room, where the temperature is always just right. Feel the air around you now. It's likely cold, perhaps carrying a dampness that seems to cling to everything, a chill that has worked its way deep into the very fabric of your rudimentary shelter, into your thin blankets, into your bones. Listen to the sounds or the distinct lack of them that greet your ears, your shelter, your most immediate personal world. presents its first silent challenges before your eyes are even fully open to the weak light. You might be lying on a rough pallet of straw, its dry stalks rustling softly with your every movement, or perhaps a corn husk mattress, which, while offering some separation from the hard ground, can feel lumpy and uneven beneath you. This pallet might be laid directly on a hard-packed dirt floor, cold and unyielding. Or maybe you have a simple cot, its canvas stretched taut across a wooden frame, offering little in the way of cushioning but perhaps a slight elevation from the chill of the earth itself. Let's imagine for a moment that your shelter is a sod house, a soddy, a common dwelling on the vast and treeless prairies where timber was a precious, almost non-existent commodity. The walls around you, the very structure that shields you from the immense emptiness outside, are made of thick to heavy blocks of earth, the very soil of the plains, laboriously cut and stacked like giant dark bricks. These blocks are held together by the dense tangled root systems of the prairie grasses, a testament to nature's own construction. You might reach out a hand in the dim light and feel the cool, slightly crumbly texture of these earthen walls. They would exude a faint and earthy smell, the scent of damp soil and growing things even when dry. These sod walls were surprisingly effective insulators against the brutal extremes of prairie weather, the bitter wind-driven cold of winter and the scorching, relentless heat of summer. But they were also permeable. Life from me, the outside could and often did find its way in the weak gray light that begins to filter through a small, perhaps greased paper window or a crack in the wall near the poorly fitted door. You'd see the gloomy interior. The ceiling above you might also be made of sod guide laid over, a layer of brush and poles, and it was not uncommon for small bits of dried mud, or the occasional insect, or even a field mouse, to dislodge and drop down unceremoniously. You might hear the soft rustlings from within the walls themselves, a reminder that you are sharing your home with the tiny creatures of the earth. Alternatively, perhaps you find yourself in a log cabin, a structure more common in wooded areas or mountain valleys where trees were plentiful. As you awaken, the air inside might carry the faint, resinous scent of pine or cedar from the logs themselves. These logs, often roughly hewn by hand with an axe, would be notched and stacked, the gaps between them chinked with whatever materials were available, mud, moss, clay, or even strips of cloth, in an effort to keep out the worst of the wind and rain. But these efforts were rarely entirely successful. You would likely feel those persistent drafts, small, insidious currents of colder air snaking across the floor or brushing against your face as you lie there, a constant reminder of the world outside pressing in. If you run your hand along the wall, you might feel the rough bark or the surprisingly smooth surface, where an adze has shaped the wood, and perhaps the occasional splinter, a tiny, sharp pain. The light filtering into a log cabin would also be minimal. Windows, if they existed, were often small, single-pane affairs, or perhaps just openings, covered with a piece of stretched animal hide, treated with oil to make it translucent. This hide would allow only a dim, yellowish, murky glow to enter, doing little to illuminate the corners of the room. You might look up and see the rough-hewn timbers of the roof, perhaps supporting a layer of wooden shingles or shakes. Small gaps where these didn't quite meet could offer tiny, tantalizing glimpses of the slowly brightening sky, or, less welcomely, become entry points for rain, melting snow, or falling debris. The sounds within a log cabin might be the creak and groan of the timbers themselves as the structure settles, or responds to changes in temperature, a sound like an old ship groaning in a heavy sea. And if your shelter is even more temporary, perhaps a canvas tent pitched in a bustling new mining camp, or alongside a wagon trail as you journey westward, then the barrier between you and the elements is thinner still. Here you would feel the wind press insistently against the fabric walls, hear its mournful whistle as it strains at the ropes and tent pegs. The cold would be an immediate, intrusive presence, seeping up from the ground through your thin bedroll, every sound from the outside world, the distant cry of a coyote as the night recedes, the stirring of nearby livestock, the first coughs and movements of other early risers in the camp would reach you with an almost startling clarity, offering little sense of privacy or protection. The very ground beneath you would feel hard and unyielding. Regardless of the specific types of structure, one of the first and most pervasive sensations upon waking is almost certainly the cold. It's a deep, penetrating cold that has settled in during the long, dark hours of the night. A cold that makes you want to huddle deeper into your coarse wool blanket, if you are fortunate enough to possess one. There's no thermostat to adjust with a sleepy hand, no central heating system to anticipate your needs and gently warm the air. The only source of significant warmth will be a fire, and that fire has likely died down to a few reluctant embers or perhaps gone out completely, leaving the air sharp and frigid. The air you draw into your lungs is crisp, perhaps even painfully so, and carries no hint of comforting heated air. Looking around, the gloomy interior as your eyes slowly adjust to the weak light, you would see the stark simplicity of your surroundings. There are no unnecessary adornments, no purely decorative items. Everything is functional and often crudely made, perhaps a rough wooden table, a few handmade stools, or a simple bench. A wooden trunk might hold your meager worldly possessions, a change of clothes, a few tools, perhaps a cherished letter or a worn book. Iron pots and pans, blackened from countless fires, might hang near a primitive stone hearth or a small cast iron stove, if you have one. There's an absence of clutter, certainly, but also an absence of comfort, as you understand it. The very walls, whether of earth or logs, might seem to close in, especially if the shelter is small, which it often was, designed more for minimal protection than for spacious living. You might see your own breath misting in the air before you. And then there's the constant quiet battle with the elements inside your home. Leaky roofs were an almost universal complaint. During a rainstorm, or as winter snows began to melt, you might hear the persistent drip, drip, drip of water finding its way through the sod, the shingles, or the canvas, a sound that could become maddeningly persistent. You'd scramble to place pots and pans to catch the water, but damp patches would spread on the floor and walls, bringing with them the smell of mildew and a pervasive, chilling dampness that was hard to escape. Dirt floors, while practical in some ways because they couldn't rot like wood, meant a never-ending struggle against dust in dry weather, a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything. When it rained, these floors could quickly turn into sticky, slippery mud, tracked in from outside and created by the leaks from above. Insects, too, were a constant and unwelcome presence. Flies and mosquitoes would drone and bite, especially in warmer weather. Spiders would spin their webs in every corner. Fleas and lice were common companions, difficult to eradicate with the limited hygiene options available. And then there were the less tiny, but equally unwelcome visitors. Mice and rats attracted by any scrap of food would rustle and squeak in the walls or under the floorboards. The occasional snake might even seek warmth or a meal within your shelter, a truly unsettling discovery. This constant, low-level stressor, this sharing of your living space with an array of vermin, meant you could never fully relax your guard, never feel entirely secure in your own home. The impact of the climate was relentless, felt directly and immediately. In winter, the cold was a palpable enemy, a physical presence that you fought against daily. Despite your best efforts to chink cracks and stoke the fire, the chill would find its way in. In summer, the heat, especially in a poorly ventilated log cabin with small windows, or a sun-baked soddy or tent, could be stifling, oppressive, offering little relief even indoors. You were, in essence, living in a slightly more structured version of the great outdoors, always subject to its whims, always feeling its direct and often harsh impact. There was a subtle, gnawing awareness of your vulnerability, not just from potential human threats, which we may discuss later, but from the sheer indifferent power of nature itself, a power that your thin walls and rudimentary roof could only partially and often imperfectly hold at bay. Beyond the immediate, sometimes harsh embrace of your simple shelter and the ever-present elements, your body soon reminds you of other deeply personal needs that must be met in this new, unforgiving reality. Now picture attending to your most basic morning rituals, those small acts of self-care we perform almost without thought, often in the warm, private, and well-lit cocoon of a modern bathroom, surrounded by pleasant scents and an abundance of cleaned, temperature-controlled water. Here in this frontier existence, you've awakened to these simple acts transform into significant efforts, each one marked by a profound lack of what you consider normal, everyday comforts, each one a small, quiet testament to the daily grit required. The first and perhaps most pressing of these for many, as the new day fully asserts itself, would be the call of nature. There is, of course, no gleaming porcelain toilet just a few steps from your bed, no flush of water to whisk everything cleanly away. Instead, you face a journey, an expedition of sorts. If your homestead or the small settlement you find yourself in is relatively established, there might be an outhouse on a small, rough wooden structure set some distance from your dwelling, a distance that can feel quite significant in the biting cold of a winter morning. Or during a drenching rainstorm, imagine stepping out from the minimal shelter of your cabin into that crisp morning air, the ground perhaps frozen solid and uneven beneath your thinly soled shoes, or thick with sticky mud that tries to claim your footwear with every step. The path to this outhouse might be ill-defined, and in the dim pre-dawn or early morning light, you'd tread carefully. The structure itself is utilitarian in the extreme, often just a simple, unpainted wooden box, a narrow door that creaks on its hinges and likely doesn't fit quite right now, allowing drafts, and sometimes snow or rain to find their way inside. Inside, it's dark. A rough-cut hole in a wooden plank serves as the seat. There's no paper, unless you are exceptionally fortunate, or resourceful enough to have saved scraps of newspaper or pages from an old catalog. Instead, dried leaves, corn cobs, or smooth stones might be the reality. And the smell would be an immediate and unavoidable presence, a damp, earthy scent mixed with the sharp, unmistakable odor of human waste, an aroma that clings to the small, confined space. You would feel the chill of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, a constant reminder of your exposure to the elements, even in this most private of moments. If an outhouse is a luxury your particular circumstance doesn't yet afford, or if you are in a more temporary camp or on the trail, the alternative is a designated outdoor spot, perhaps a discreet bush some way from the main living area, or a shallow trench dug for the purpose. Here, the lack of privacy is even more pronounced, the exposure to the weather complete. This daily, essential ritual, so private and straightforward for you now, becomes a very public and often uncomfortable negotiation with nature, with weather, and with a level of sanitation that would be deeply concerning to modern sensibilities. Next, let your mind drift to the act of washing. The concept of a leisurely hot shower, the steam filling the air, or a long, relaxing soak in a deep tub filled with fragrant bubbles is so far removed from this reality as to be pure fantasy. Water, as we've touched upon, is an incredibly precious commodity, not to be used frivolously, and the water you have for washing is almost certainly cold. perhaps drawn hours or even a day earlier, and left standing in a bucket or basin inside your cabin. Imagine dipping your hands into this water. It feels shockingly icy against your skin, especially on a frigid morning, sending a jolt through your system. You might have a single tin or enamel basin, and you'd pour a small amount of this precious cold water into it. The soap, if you have it, is unlikely to be a beautifully scented, gentle bar designed to moisturize your skin. More probably, it's a harsh, homemade lye soap, perhaps yellow or dark brown with a faint, sharp smell of its own. It would be effective for cutting through grime and grease, but also quite abrasive and drying to the skin. You would use it sparingly, a quick splash of water on your face, a cursory wash of your hands, the feel of that cold water, the roughness of the lye soap against your skin. These are the sensations of your morning ablutions. There's a rawness to the experience, a bracing directness that is a world away from the softened, scented and warmed rituals of modern hygiene. A full body wash would be an infrequent event, perhaps weekly if conditions allowed. Involving heating water over the fire, a laborious task in itself, and using a larger tub, often in the same room where you cook and live. The collection of this vital water is a chore in itself, a significant and often arduous daily labor, usually falling to the women or older children of the household. Picture yourself or someone in your imagined family trudging to the nearest water source. This could be a hand-dug well, fitted with a simple rope and bucket, or perhaps a windlass, whose groan and creak as you turn the handle is a familiar sound in the morning quiet. Or it might be a creek, a river, or a spring, sometimes, a considerable walk from your home. You'd carry heavy wooden buckets, their iron hoops cold to the touch, their weight growing with every step on the return journey, straining your arms and back. You'd feel the surprising heft of a full bucket, the way the water sloshes and tries to escape with your movement. You might slip on slick rocks by the creekside or struggle through snowdrifts in winter. All for those essential few gallons of water. And there would always be that quiet underlying concern about the water's purity. While the full understanding of germ theory was largely absent for much of this period, people knew from hard, bitter experience that bad water could lead to terrible sickness, the dreaded summer complaint in children, or more severe illnesses like typhoid or cholera. So you might scan the water source, looking for obvious signs of contamination like animal waste or excessive muddiness. But ultimately, each ladleful dipped for drinking, each basin filled for washing, carried with it a small unspoken risk. The water might have a clean metallic scent if drawn from a deep cold well, or a slightly stagnant organic smell if from a slow-moving creek or a shallow pond. And what of your dental care in this era? For many, it would be rudimentary. At best, perhaps a quick scrub of the teeth with a finger and some salt or a bit of powdered charcoal or soot from the fireplace, if anything at all. Toothbrushes, as we know them, were not common items on the frontier. As a result, toothaches, gum infections, and tooth decay were rampant. Imagine the misery of a throbbing toothache with no dentist to visit, no effective pain. Relief beyond perhaps a sip of whiskey or a folk remedy of questionable efficacy. Extraction, often performed by a local blacksmith or anyone with a sturdy pair of pliers and a strong arm, was often the only and terrifying remedy for a persistently painful tooth. You can almost feel a sympathetic twinge, a deeper empathy for the kind of quiet, enduring suffering that such a seemingly simple ailment could inflict in this time. Finally, you would turn to getting dressed for the day. Your wardrobe is likely to be extremely limited, consisting of perhaps 2 or 3 outfits at most, made from coarse, incredibly durable fabrics like homespun wool, heavy linen, often called tow linen, or sturdy cotton canvas. These clothes are not chosen for fashion, for softness, or for their flattering cut, but primarily for their ability to withstand incredibly hard wear and tear, to offer some measure of protection, however minimal, from the biting wind, the scratching brush, or the dirt and grime of daily labor. Imagine the feel of this stiff, unyielding fabric against your skin. It might be slightly scratchy, perhaps still a little damp from the previous day's labor if it hasn't dried completely by the fire or carrying the faint, smoky scent of your cabin. There are no easy care blends, no lycra for stretch and comfort. Buttons might be missing, replaced with a string or a thorn. Seams might be crudely mended by your own hand. Time and time again, because replacing clothes was a significant expense, if they had to be bought, or a major, time-consuming undertaking if they had to be made from scratch, involving spinning the thread, weaving the cloth, and then hand-stitching every seam. And laundry, as we've briefly touched upon, was not a simple matter of tossing soiled items into a machine and pressing a button. It was an arduous and often all-day physical ordeal, usually undertaken only once a week, if that frequently. It involved hauling and heating vast quantities of water over an open fire, scrubbing clothes by hand with that harsh lye soap on a rough, corrugated washboard until your knuckles were raw and your back ached, then rinsing them in more hauled water, wringing them out by hand, a feat of surprising strength and endurance, and then hanging them on lines strung between trees or fences to dry, hoping the weather would hold and that dust or ash wouldn't settle on them. So the clothes you put on each morning might not feel or smell entirely fresh by your modern standards. Each layer you don is a practical necessity, a shield against the world, rather than an expression of personal style or a source of soft comfort. The rustle of this stiff clothing, as you move, would be a constant, subtle reminder of the unyielding nature of your surroundings. With these fundamental needs addressed as best as one could in such circumstances, your attention, and indeed your body's urgent, hollow call, would turn towards the essential task of finding and preparing the morning's sustenance, the chill that still clings to the air, inside your rudimentary shelter, the efforts you've already expended since waking. From your rough bed and attending to your basic and demanding needs, would undoubtedly awaken a deep and gnawing hunger within you, a primal call from your body for energy to face the long day ahead, but satisfying. This hunger is another of the morning's vital, deliberate tasks, beginning with the very source of warmth and the essential means of cooking, the fire itself. If the fire from the previous night has died down to a few precious, faintly glowing embers hidden beneath a blanket of gray ash, you would carefully, gently coax it back to life. Imagine yourself kneeling before the hearth or the small iron stove, using a piece of wood or a bird's wing to delicately fan those embers, adding tiny, dry twigs or scraps of flammable material, watching with focused anticipation for the first hesitant flicker of a new flame. You'd feel the subtle warmth begin to radiate, a small victory against the persistent cold. If, however, the fire has gone out completely during the long, cold night, you face the more challenging and sometimes frustrating task of starting it anew. Picture yourself striking a piece of flint against steel, the sharp metallic click echoing in the quiet cabin, hoping to catch a spark on your carefully prepared tinder, perhaps some dried moss you've gathered, a shred of well-worn linen, or a specially prepared piece of charred cloth designed to ignite easily. This could take many attempts, your fingers growing numb in the cold, your patience tested, or maybe you have access to the relatively new invention of friction matches, though these were often unreliable, prone to dampness, and had to be used with great parsimony, as they were a precious bought commodity. You'd feel that focused tension in this crucial moment, a quiet anxiety, Because, without fire, there is no cooked food, no boiling water for a warming drink, and no real defense against the pervasive, bone-chilling cold that seems to seep through the very walls. Once the kindling finally catches, sending up a small, hopeful curl of smoke and a tiny, dancing flame, you would slowly, carefully, add larger pieces of fuel. This fuel itself is a resource that has to be constantly gathered and prepared. If you are on the vast, open prairies, wood might be a scarce and distant luxury. In its place, buffalo chips, the dried dung of bison, or tightly twisted bundles of hay or dried grasses might be your primary fuel. You would become accustomed to the particular, somewhat pungent and uniquely smoky aroma these materials emitted as they burned, a smell that would permeate your small dwelling, clinging to your clothes, your hair, and the fabric of your surroundings. In more wooded areas, you or others in your household would have spent countless hours chopping, splitting, and hauling wood, a constant, looming chore that was never truly finished. The sharp, resinous scent of pine kindling, catching fire, or the deeper, earthier smell of oak or hickory would be a familiar and welcome fragrance. The sound of the newly lit fire would be a comforting presence. The sharp crackle and hiss as the flames take hold, the gentle roar as it grows stronger. With the fire now established, either in an open hearth where pots might hang from a swinging crane, or on the flat top of a small cast iron cook stove, the preparation of the morning meal can finally begin. And that meal, for many who lived on the frontier, would be characterized by its stark simplicity, its often unvarying monotony, and its primary focus on providing sheer caloric necessity rather than culinary delight or variety. Picture the typical fare that might greet you. Perhaps some kind of cornbread or johnny cakes, made from coarsely ground cornmeal mixed with water, or perhaps a little precious milk, if you were fortunate enough to have a cow, and a pinch of salt. This batter would be cooked on a greased griddle, or in a heavy cast iron skillet, directly over the heat. You can almost taste its dense, perhaps slightly gritty texture, its simple, honest, and filling quality. It wouldn't be light and fluffy, but rather substantial, one designed to stick to your ribs. Alongside this, if your circumstances allowed, there might be a few slices of bacon or salt pork. These meats were staples on the frontier due to their longevity when preserved through salting or smoking. You'd hear the satisfying, sharp sizzle as the fatty meat hits the hot pan, the aroma rich and savory, a welcome promise of fat and protein in a diet that was often lean. The taste of this preserved meat would be intense, heavily salted, to a degree that might seem overwhelming to a modern palate. But that saltiness was key to its preservation and also helped to replenish salts lost through hard, physical labor. Coffee, if you were fortunate enough to afford it and have access to it, was a cherished ritual, a small comfort in a hard life, though often it was a far cry from the rich, aromatic brew you might know. It might be made from green coffee beans that you would have to roast yourself over the fire, a delicate process requiring constant attention to avoid burning, and then grind by hand in a small, laborious mill. The rhythmic grinding of those beans, a slightly crunchy, resistive sound, would be another of the morning's familiar noises. More commonly, especially in leaner times or in more remote locations where true coffee was an expensive luxury, it could be an ersatz coffee, a substitute brewed from roasted grains like barley or rye or from dried and roasted chicory root. This would produce a dark wine, somewhat bitter beverage that mimicked the appearance and the comforting warmth, if not the true complex flavor of real coffee. You can almost taste that watery bitterness, or if you are lucky, the precious, deeply smoky flavor of the genuine article, often boiled for a long time on the stove until it was strong, dark, and potent. Fresh fruits and vegetables would be a seasonal rarity for many, dependent entirely on your location, the time of year, and your ability to cultivate a productive garden or to trade for such luxuries. The diet, for the most part, was often heavy, reliant on preserved goods grains and whatever game might be hunted. It lacked the vibrant variety, the fresh crispness, and the year-round availability of produce that we take completely for granted today. The time-consuming nature of this food preparation is also hard for us to fully grasp. Every single ingredient likely required some form of manual processing before it even reached the cooking pot. Grains needed to be ground. The water, as we've discussed, had to be hauled for cooking and for the inevitable cleaning up. Tending the fire was a constant, underlying task, ensuring it didn't die down or flare up too high and burn the precious food. There were no instant mixes, no pre-packaged meals, no microwave to speed things along. Every meal was, in essence, made from scratch, a testament to daily effort. You might handle a rough-textured wooden bowl or a heavy chipped ceramic plate, utilitarian items designed for durability rather than elegance. Your relationship with food in this context would be profoundly different from our own. It was, first and foremost, fuel. Essential energy for the hard, unrelenting physical labor that the day would demand. Blandness was common, and variety was a luxury. Sometimes, sheer scarcity was the overriding concern. For many, there was an underlying quiet worry, a persistent hum of anxiety about where the next meal or the meals for the coming lean winter months would truly come from, especially if a crop failed, if a hunting expedition was unsuccessful, or if stored provisions ran dangerously low. Each bite was perhaps taken with a greater awareness, a more profound, if unspoken, gratitude for its presence, for the simple fact that there was something to eat, something to keep body and soul together for another day in this demanding world. With the morning meal concluded, a brief and simple affair perhaps, offering more sustenance than pleasure, the true labor of the day now looms large. The sun is climbing, its light now more assertive, and its journey across the sky dictates yours. It's a time to step out fully into the demands of this untamed world. As the sun climbs higher in the great, open sky, casting shorter shadows and perhaps a more intense burning heat down upon the land, or maybe a brighter, colder light if your imagined journey has placed you in a different season or elevation. The brief respite of morning, if any true respite was found, is definitively over. The vast majority of your waking hours in this frontier existence, from this point until the sun once again dips below the horizon, would be consumed by work, a relentless, often unforgiving, physical demand that shaped your body, your days, and your very perception of time. There were truly no easy options here. No convenient shortcuts to lighten the load. No readily available labor-saving devices as you know them. For most people who found themselves carving out a life in these untamed lands, existence was an unceasing cycle of physical labor, a continuous output of energy that began before the sun had fully announced its arrival, and often ended only when deep exhaustion and the encroaching darkness made further effort impossible, or at least profoundly unwise. Imagine yourself first as a homesteader, a farmer, attempting to cultivate a life from the often stubborn and unyielding land. If you are on the vast prairies, your initial monumental task, after perhaps erecting your rudimentary shelter, might have been to break the virgin sod. This wasn't like turning over soft garden soil. The prairie grasses over centuries had developed root systems that were incredibly dense, thickly tangled, and astonishingly tough, matted together just beneath the surface in a near impenetrable web. You might be using a heavy walking plow, its single share designed to slice through this living carpet. This plow would likely be pulled by a team of slow, ponderous, yet immensely strong oxen as creatures that required constant, patient guidance, their broad hooves sinking slightly into the earth with each step. Feel the strain in your own shoulders, your arms, your back, as you grip the worn wooden plow handles, your knuckles white, trying to keep the blade cutting true and deep through that resistant earth. The sun beats down relentlessly on your shoulders, and you can feel the burn of sweat as it trickles into your eyes, blurring your vision of the long, dark, unbroken furrow coiling laboriously behind you. Each step is a conscious effort. Each newly turned acre, a hard-won, almost monumental victory against the sheer scale of the land. The air around you becomes thick, with the rich, loamy scent of freshly turned earth, an ancient, fertile smell, mixed, perhaps with the metallic tang of your own exertion and the warm animal scent of the oxen. Fine dust, raised by your efforts and the plodding hooves, coats your skin, your rough-spun clothes, settles in your hair and finds its way into the corners of your eyes and the dryness of your throat. You see the seemingly endless rows of yet-to-be-broken prairie stretching out before you under that vast, indifferent sky, a silent testament to the immense task still ahead. Once a patch of land is finally broken, then comes the planting, perhaps corn, a staple crop, or wheat, or maybe some hardy root vegetables if the climate and soil grudgingly allow. This is often done by hand in walking the newly turned rows, your back bent for what feels like an eternity under that same expansive sky. Carefully dropping individual seeds into the soil, covering them with your foot or a hoe. Then begins the constant wearying battle against weeds, which seem to possess a malevolent, tenacious vigor, springing up with astonishing speed, threatening to choke the life from your precious nascent crops. You might spend countless hours on your hands and knees and pulling these intruders one by one, or bent over with a simple, heavy hoe, the repetitive chop-chop-chop motion leading to a dull and persistent ache that settles deep in your lower back and shoulders. And always, throughout this entire cycle, you are utterly dependent on the weather, a capricious and powerful force entirely beyond your control. Too little rain, and your carefully tended crops wither and die in the parched earth, your hopes for a harvest shriveling along with them. Too much rain, especially at the wrong time, and your plants might rot in the fields, or the seeds might be washed away before they can even sprout. An unseasonable frost in late spring or early autumn, a sudden violent hailstorm that can shred leaves and flatten stalks in a matter of minutes. These acts of nature could wipe out months of your backbreaking labor in a single devastating blow, a truly heartbreaking setback. There is also a profound, almost tangible loneliness to this kind of solitary farm work, often undertaken far from the sight or sound of another human being, with only the ceaseless sigh of the wind across the open plains, the caw of a distant crow, or the rhythmic thud of your own hoe for company. The silence of these solitary fields might be broken only by the sound of your own breath, heavy with effort and the quiet internal monologue of worries and hopes. If your life in this imagined West is tied to ranching, the nature of the work is different, certainly, but it is no less demanding, no less exposed to the elements. You would spend long, grueling hours in the saddle of a sturdy horse, feeling the constant rocking motion beneath you, the chafe of rough denim against your skin, the familiar creak of saddle leather, and the jingle of your simple harness. Your eyes would be constantly scanning the vast horizon, squinting against the sun's glare, searching for stray cattle, for signs of predators like wolves or coyotes, or in some areas, for the unwelcome and potentially dangerous sight of rustlers. The work would involve mending miles upon miles of fences, often using rudimentary tools and materials found on the land. Rounding up herds scattered across immense pastures and the physically dangerous tasks of branding calves or driving cattle hundreds of miles to the nearest railhead or market, often across vast waterless and perilous terrain, would demand incredible endurance and resilience. You'd feel the oppressive heat of the sun beating down on your hat and shoulders during long summer drives, or the bite of a cold wind as you mend a fence in the fading light of an autumn afternoon. And what if your primary sphere, your domain of relentless labor, was the domestic one? For many women on the frontier, this was a realm of unceasing and multifaceted work that was every bit as physically demanding and every bit as essential for survival as the toil in the fields or on the open range. Imagine the endless, cyclical nature of these chores, performed day in and day out, often within the cramped and smoky confines of your small cabin or sod house, cooking, not just for one simple meal but for three, usually over an open hearth where you'd constantly battle smoke and shifting heat, or on a temperamental wood-burning stove that required constant feeding and regulation. This task alone, from preparing the ingredients to serving the food and then cleaning the heavy iron pots and pans with coarse sand or homemade soap, would consume a significant portion of your day. You'd feel the intense heat radiating from the fire, especially in the sweltering summer months, making your small home almost unbearable. Cleaning, without the aid of vacuum cleaners, spray polishes, or modern detergents, meant a constant, wearying battle against dust that seeped in from outside, mud tracked in on boots, soot from the fireplace or stove that settled on every surface, and the ever-present threat of vermin. You'd be sweeping with a rough-hew or a handmade broom, scrubbing floors on your hands and knees with a stiff brush and harsh lye soap, wiping down surfaces with a damp rag, the repetitive motions leading to aches in your wrists and back. Laundry, as we've touched upon before, was a monumental all-day physical ordeal typically undertaken only once a week if you were lucky, a task that would leave you utterly exhausted, your hands red and raw. Then there was childcare, often with several young children of varying ages, underfoot in a small, potentially hazardous space, their needs for food, comfort, and supervision absolutely constant. Tending a vegetable garden, if you were fortunate enough to have one, was crucial for supplementing the often monotonous diet of preserved meats and grains. This meant more hours spent digging in the hard earth, planting seeds, pulling weeds and harvesting whatever produce you could coax from the soil, all while likely keeping an eye on your young children. Preserving this food for the long, lean winter months was a vital and incredibly labor-intensive process, canning fruits and vegetables in glass jars, sealed with wax, if you could get them, drying strips of meat or fruit in the sun, pickling cucumbers or cabbage, salting down pork or fish, all ensuring that the precious fruits of summer's labor would last through the cold, hungry times. You would also be responsible for making and mending clothes for the entire family, often by hand with needle and thread, a painstaking task done by dim lamplight in the evenings, and tending to small livestock, like a flock of chickens for eggs or a milk cow for precious dairy. Added further daily responsibilities, feeding, watering, milking, and protecting them from predators. There was truly no clear demarcation between your work and your life, no quitting time to signal the end of your duties. The tasks were simply always there, a relentless demand on your time and your physical strength. You would feel the repetitive strain in your wrists from churning butter by hand for what seemed like hours, the deep ache in your arms from kneading heavy batches of dough for bread, or the burn in your legs from constantly being on your feet, moving from one demanding task to the next. For almost everyone on the frontier, regardless of their primary role, There was a distinct and often frustrating lack of specialization. You couldn't simply call a plumber if a pipe froze, if you even had pipes, or an electrician. If a lamp failed, as electricity was a distant dream. If a tool broke, a piece of harness snapped, or a part of your cabin needed urgent repair, you or someone in your immediate family or small, interdependent community had to possess the practical skills and ingenuity to fix it. Repairing. Tools. Sharpening blades until your arms ached. Building and mending fences to keep precious livestock in or predators out. Even basic carpentry to make a new stool or patch a leaky roof, or rudimentary blacksmithing to fix a broken plowshare. These were often skills learned out of sheer pressing necessity, adding another layer of responsibility and effort to the already heavy burden of daily work. And the inevitable result of all this: unceasing, multifaceted physical effort, a pervasive, bone-deep fatigue that would settle over you long before midday, a profound weariness that few of us in the modern world, with our countless labor-saving devices and more typically sedentary lifestyles, can truly and fully comprehend. Wasn't just the satisfying tiredness you might feel after a good workout at the gym or a long hike. It was a profound, cumulative exhaustion, etched deeply into your muscles, your joints, your very being. Yet, despite this crushing fatigue, you would have to push through it, hour after relentless hour, in day after weary day, because the work simply had to be done. Your survival, and that of your family, depended entirely upon it. Your hands would be rough, calloused, perhaps permanently stained from dirt and labor, maybe even cracked and sore from exposure to harsh soaps and cold weather, a visible, tangible testament to the unyielding nature of your daily tasks. This constant, heavy toil, this daily pouring out of your physical strength, was not the only challenge, for even as you worked on unseen threats carried on the air or in the water, were an ever-present part of life, capable of striking anyone at any time. But the demands on your body were not solely from labor, however grueling and relentless that might have been. Even as you toiled under the sun or within the smoky confines of your modest dwelling, an invisible world of threats existed, a world of sickness that people of this time understood only through its often devastating and seemingly arbitrary effects. For much of the 19th century, the fundamental understanding of what caused many diseases, the concept that tiny, unseen living organisms, germs, bacteria, viruses, could invade the body and wreak havoc, was not widely known nor accepted, even by many of those who considered themselves medical practitioners. Instead, illness was often attributed to a host of other, more nebulous causes. Perhaps it was thought to be due to bad air or miasma, invisible emanations from swamps or decaying matter that were believed to carry sickness. Or it might be ascribed to an imbalance in the body's humors, an ancient theory involving blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or sometimes, quite simply, to the inscrutable will of a higher power, or just plain unavoidable bad luck. This lack of understanding about the true nature of infectious disease had profound consequences. It meant that basic hygiene practices that we now recognize as critically important in preventing the spread of illness, such as thoroughly washing your hands with soap and clean water, especially after using the privy or before handling food, or diligently protecting water sources from contamination by human and animal waste, or isolating those who were sick to prevent transmission. These practices were not consistently understood or implemented. You can begin to imagine how this environment, coupled with the often crowded and unsanitary conditions in some frontier settlements or temporary camps, made individuals and entire communities incredibly vulnerable to outbreaks of contagious disease. And the diseases themselves were formidable adversaries, many of which are now largely preventable through routine vaccinations, or are easily treatable with the array of effective medicines we have at our disposal today. Consider for a moment the terror inspired by illnesses like typhoid fever and cholera. These were often waterborne diseases, spreading rapidly and with deadly efficiency through communities whose water sources, perhaps a shallow well or a nearby creek, had become contaminated. Imagine the sudden, alarming onset of a high, unrelenting fever, accompanied by severe abdominal pain, debilitating weakness, and persistent diarrhea if typhoid took hold. Or picture the even more rapid and violent progression of cholera, with its profuse, watery diarrhea and vomiting, leading to extreme dehydration, muscle cramps, and a shocking, swift decline that could see a seemingly healthy person succumb in a matter of days or sometimes even hours. You might recall our earlier discussion about the challenges of sourcing clean water, and a quiet chill might run down your spine as you make the connection, realizing just how easily these invisible threats could infiltrate the very liquid essential for life. Dysentery, another illness often linked to poor sanitation and contaminated water, caused agonizing intestinal inflammation and was a common, often fatal affliction, particularly for infants and young children, whose small bodies could not withstand such an assault for long. Then there were the respiratory illnesses, which flourished in conditions of close living and exposure to harsh weather. Influenza, or the grip, as it was often called, could sweep through a community, and while it might seem like a familiar ailment to us in an era without antiviral medications or effective supportive care for complications like pneumonia, it was a far more serious and frequently fatal condition. Pneumonia itself, whether as a complication of influenza or arising on its own, was a dreaded diagnosis, often referred to as the old man's friend for its perceived quick dispatch, but it struck down people of all ages. You might imagine someone struggling for each breath, their chest tight and painful, the sound of their shallow, ragged breathing filling the quiet of a sick room. Tuberculosis, then commonly known as consumption for the way it seemed to slowly consume its victims from within, cast a long, grim shadow over countless families. It was a slow, insidious disease, causing a persistent, racking cough, you-drenching night sweats, a gradual wasting away of the body, and an unshakable fatigue. You might picture the stale, close air of a room where someone with consumption lay, the windows perhaps kept closed against the perceived dangers of fresh air. The only sound, the heartbreaking cough, and the hushed, anxious whispers of worried family members. Malaria, with its recurring cycles of intense bone-shaking chills, followed by raging fever and drenching sweats, was prevalent in certain swampy or humid regions of the expanding West. And the common childhood diseases, measles, mumps, whooping cough, diphtheria with its terrifying choking throat membrane, scarlet fever with its bright rash and high fever, these illnesses, which, today, many children are protected from through a simple series of vaccinations, were then frequent and often devastating visitors to nearly every family, frequently leading to lifelong disability, such as deafness or blindness, or all too often, to the heartbreaking loss of a child. The sheer number of small, often unmarked or simply carved as graves in old frontier cemeteries tells a silent, poignant story of these repeated losses. Now, try to picture yourself, or a cherished loved one, a child, a spouse, a sibling, and falling gravely ill with one of these fearsome ailments. What medical care could you possibly hope for in such a situation? The options were starkly limited, and more often than not very effective against the true cause of the illness. In many isolated homesteads or small scattered settlements, there might be no formally trained doctor for hundreds of miles. Your primary caregiver would almost certainly be a family member, usually a woman, a mother, a wife, an older sister, relying on traditional folk remedies that had been passed down through generations, on her own instincts, and on an immense capacity for patient devoted nursing. She might be or you might turn to, a local healer, often an older woman in the community who was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her practical experience in tending the sick. You can almost smell the pungent, earthy, or sometimes sharply aromatic scent of various herbs being brewed into teas or mashed into poultices to be applied to the skin, concoctions of willow bark, perhaps, for reducing fever, as it contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, plantain leaves for drawing out infection from a wound, or maybe horehound or mullein for soothing a persistent cough. Some of these traditional remedies may indeed have offered a degree of symptomatic relief, a small measure of comfort, but they could not cure serious bacterial or viral infections. If you were in a somewhat larger town, or if one of the ubiquitous traveling doctors of the era happened to pass through your area, you might gain access to someone with a modicum of more formal, though still very limited by our standards, medical training. These doctors often carried their entire pharmacopoeia and toolkit in a small black bag. Inside, you might find a stethoscope for listening to the heart and lungs, a thermometer for measuring fever, some basic surgical instruments like scalpels and forceps, and a collection of various bottles and packets containing their medicines. However, many of these medicines were of dubious value, and some were actively harmful. Potent purgatives, designed to violently empty the bowels, or emetics, to induce vomiting, were commonly prescribed with the idea of cleansing the system of whatever was causing the illness. Other concoctions might be heavily laced with opiates, such as laudanum, tincture of opium, or alcohol, which certainly dulled pain and might induce a state of stupor, giving the appearance of relief, but did little or nothing to address the underlying infection. Bloodletting, though its popularity was thankfully declining by the latter half of the 19th century, was still sometimes practiced for certain conditions, further weakening an already debilitated patient. And if a surgical procedure was deemed absolutely unavoidable, perhaps for a badly infected wound or a complicated childbirth, it was a terrifying prospect. Such operations were often performed without any effective anesthesia for much of this period, meaning patients would endure unimaginable, excruciating pain. Furthermore, the critical importance of antiseptic practices, keeping wounds instruments and the surgeon's hands scrupulously clean to prevent infection, was not widely understood or implemented until later in the century, following the pioneering work of figures like Lister. Consequently, post-surgical infections were rampant and very often fatal. Imagine the profound, cold grip of fear that would squeeze your chest as you watched a loved one weaken before your eyes, their fever climbing uncontrollably, their breathing becoming more shallow and labored. You would feel the burning heat of their skin under your trembling hand as you tried to offer what little comfort you could, perhaps repeatedly wiping their brow with a cool, damp cloth, one of the few tangible solaces available. In such a desperate situation, you would hear the shallow, ragged quality of their breath, or the persistent, racking cough that offered no relief, only further exhaustion. You might sit by their bedside for days and nights on end, in the stale, close air of the sick room, listening to their delirious mutterings or the hushed, anxious whispers exchanged between other family members. Your own heart, heavy with a sickening mixture of fading hope and rising dread, and sometimes an unnerving, profound quiet would fall in the room. A quiet that signaled a crisis point had been reached. A quiet that could herald either a miraculous turn for the better or the silent or final surrender to the illness. The emotional sensations of these times would be etched deeply into your memory. That cold grip of helpless fear, the heavy, suffocating weight of your inability to alleviate their suffering, and, all too often, the dull, enduring ache of grief when all efforts failed and another loved one was lost. The impact of these invisible threats on daily life was immense. The constant shadow of potential illness would color every decision, every interaction. Funerals were a frequent, sorrowful occurrence in every community, and the capacity for resilience, for finding the strength to carry on in the face of such repeated, heartbreaking loss, had to be almost superhuman. Illness was a pervasive shadow, but the physical world itself, in its raw and untamed state, presented more immediate, tangible dangers. Accidents, both big and small, were a constant companion to daily life and labor, beyond the invisible threat of disease that always lingered in the air and water. The very landscape you inhabited, the tools essential for your survival, and the animals you depended upon, held their own, more immediate, and often startlingly tangible potential for harm. Life on the frontier, for every man, woman, and child, was a constant, unspoken negotiation with physical risk, a daily dance where a single misstep, a moment's inattention, or a simple piece of bad luck could lead to serious, and sometimes catastrophic, injury. The world was simply a more physically perilous place. Imagine yourself engaged in the routine tasks of the day. If you are working in the fields, perhaps guiding that heavy plow we spoke of earlier, it could lurch unexpectedly if it struck a hidden rock or a tough root, throwing you violently off-balanced, or worse, pulling you down where the heavy implement or the hooves of the oxen could cause serious harm. Scythe, used for harvesting grain or cutting tall wild hay, with its long, wickedly curved blade, required immense skill and concentration to wield safely. A moment's distraction, a slip on uneven ground, and that razor-sharp steel could inflict a deep wound to a leg or arm in an instant. Axes, indispensable for chopping firewood to heat your home and cook your food, or for felling trees to build your cabin and fences, were a constant source of danger. An axe head could fly off a worn handle, or the blade could glance off a knot in the wood, deflecting with surprising force. You might almost hear the sharp, percussive crack of a wooden tool, handle breaking under strain, followed by a sudden, startled cry of pain that cuts through the otherwise quiet air of your workday. Even simpler tools held risks. Knives were used for everything from preparing food and skinning game to whittling a new tool handle or mending a piece of harness could slip, leading to deep, bleeding cuts on your hands or fingers. Animals, too, however familiar or seemingly placid, were a common source of injury. The usually docile horse could be spooked by a sudden noise or an unseen threat, bucking and throwing its rider heavily to the hard ground, resulting in broken bones, a concussion, or other serious internal injuries. An ox, or a cow, and powerful and sometimes unpredictable creatures, could deliver a crushing kick with a hind leg if you weren't careful, or gore with their horns if they felt threatened, or were simply in a contrary mood. Even smaller animals like a dog or a pig, if provoked, or rabid, a terrifying, though thankfully not everyday possibility, could inflict nasty bites that were prone to dangerous infection, and fire, that essential element. For warmth and cooking was a constant dual-edged sword. Open hearths and wood-burning stoves, while providing life-sustaining heat, were also ever-present hazards. A pot of water or stew, bubbling over the flames, could easily scald you if it tipped or if you stumbled too close. A spark from the fire could leap out and ignite a piece of your clothing, or a nearby piece of flammable material like a curtain or a pile of kindling, leading to searing pain and disfiguring burns in an instant. For children, especially, the allure and danger of the fire were a constant concern for parents, and with rivers, creeks, and even simple water barrels often unfenced and unguarded, and with few people in that era knowing how to swim proficiently, drowning was a tragically common occurrence, especially for the young or unwary who might slip and fall into the cold, unforgiving water. You might imagine the sickening thud of someone falling from a poorly constructed ladder while trying to mend a roof, or from a high hayloft in a barn. In your mind's eye, you might see the immediate vivid crimson color of blood blooming starkly against the rough, dun-colored fabric of a homespun shirt, or spreading quickly on the dusty, packed earth of your cabin floor. Or you might picture the unnatural, alarming angle of a limb, clearly broken, a sight that would send a chill of dread through you. For those engaged in specific industries that were an integral part of westward expansion, the workplace hazards could be even more acute and almost entirely unregulated. Think of miners, for instance, working long hours deep underground in dark, cramped and poorly ventilated tunnels. They faced the constant, terrifying threat of cave-ins that could bury them alive, or sudden, violent explosions from pockets of methane gas ignited by their open flame lamps, or from the mishandled black powder used for blasting rock. And even if they avoided such dramatic ends, many suffered the slower and insidious damage to their lungs from constantly inhaling rock dust, leading to debilitating conditions. Consider also the men who built the transcontinental railroads, laying heavy steel rails and wooden ties across vast, often hostile and difficult territories. They worked with massive, heavy materials, used dangerous explosives to blast tunnels through mountains or clear pathways, and faced constant dangers from equipment failure, landslides, and sheer grinding exhaustion. Loggers, Duriwa, felling giant, ancient trees in remote forests with only axes and long, two-man crosscut saws, risked being crushed by falling timber or severely injured by out-of-control logs skidding down a mountainside. The sounds associated with these industries, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel, the muffled roar of dynamite, the resounding crash of timber, were often, tragically, punctuated by the sounds of human injury and cries for help that might go unanswered in the cacophony. And when an accident did inevitably happen, when a bone was broken, a deep wound inflicted, or a serious burn sustained, there was no quick call to emergency services, no wail of an approaching ambulance to bring skilled paramedics and swift transport to a sterile, well-equipped hospital emergency room. Those things simply did not exist in this world. A badly broken leg, which today might be expertly set, perhaps internally fixed with pins and plates, and then encased in a lightweight cast within hours, could, in this frontier context, be a profoundly life-altering or even a life-ending spacient event. This was especially true if you were miles from any settlement, or if the break was a compound fracture, where the bone pierced the skin, leaving an open pathway for devastating infection. Infection, in fact, was one of the greatest and most feared killers following almost any significant injury. In an era before the widespread understanding of germ theory, before the routine use of antiseptics, and, certainly, long before the advent of antibiotics, even a seemingly minor wound, a deep cut from a dirty tool, a puncture from a rusty nail or a barbed wire fence, an animal bite, could easily become dangerously infected. You would watch with mounting dread as the area around the wound became red, swollen, hot to the touch, and excruciatingly painful. A raging fever might set in, accompanied by chills and delirium, the dreaded gangrene, a horrifying, condition where tissue dies and decays could develop, often necessitating a desperate, crude amputation with no guarantee of success, and certainly with no effective anesthesia to dull the unimaginable agony of such a procedure. The throbbing ache of a sprain or a break, the searing pain of that burn, or the sharp, relentless agony of a deep infected cut would be your constant companion, and with it, a rising tide of fear, knowing just how precarious your situation had become, how easily your life could slip away from such a seemingly small beginning. People had to rely almost entirely on themselves, their families, or perhaps a kind neighbor who might possess some rudimentary knowledge of treating injuries, often based more on tradition or trial and error than on medical science. They would do their best. They might try to clean the wound, perhaps with precious water of questionable purity, or sometimes with raw spirits like whiskey or turpentine, which would bite and burn with an intensity all its pain endured, in the desperate hope of preventing something worse. They might attempt to crudely set a broken bone as best they could, using straight pieces of wood scavenged from the surroundings for splints and strips of old cloth for bandages. You can almost feel the rough, uneven texture of such a makeshift bandage against your injured skin, offering little in the way of true support or comfort. The pain of these interventions, without any effective anesthetic beyond perhaps a large dose of alcohol to induce a state of semi-consciousness, would be immense, a trial of human endurance. And then came the long, uncertain, and often agonizing period of recovery, if recovery was indeed to happen at all. The fear of a wound going bad, as they would often say, was a constant, terrifying shadow. Beyond these traumatic injuries resulting from accidents, simple exposure to the often harsh and unforgiving elements was a continual threat that could lead to serious harm or death. Hypothermia, from being caught out in a sudden blizzard while checking on livestock or traveling between settlements, or from an accidental fall into icy river water, could quickly overwhelm your body's ability to maintain its core temperature, leading to confusion, lethargy, and eventually the fatal slide into unconsciousness. You might imagine the chilling numbness spreading insidiously through your fingers and toes, then creeping up your limbs, your movements becoming clumsy, your thoughts muddled, as the cold relentlessly saps your strength and will to live. Conversely, heat stroke, under the relentless glare of the summer sun, especially during periods of intense physical labor without adequate shade or hydration, was an equally perilous danger. You might feel the dizzying, oppressive heat making your head swim, your skin hot and dry, your heart pounding, as your body's cooling mechanisms failed, leading to confusion, collapse, and potentially a fatal outcome. These were not abstract possibilities. They were genuine dangers that people faced with alarming regularity, a constant reminder of their vulnerability in a world that offered few buffers against its extremes. As the sun begins its slow descent, painting the western sky with fleeting, often spectacular colors of orange, red, and purple, the nature of your day and the challenges you face begins to shift. The heaviest and most physically demanding toil may lessen as the light fades in, but new considerations and the encroaching, deepening darkness bring their own unique set of challenges and experiences to navigate with the sun. Beginning its slow descent, casting long, stretching shadows across the land, painting the grasses and the distant hills in softer, warmer hues of gold and amber. The most demanding physical labors of the day might, if you really fortunate, start to ease. Your muscles would still ache with a deep, resonant fatigue from the hours of toil, but perhaps the urgency, the relentless pace, begins to subside just a little. And as your body finds a moment of comparative rest, your thoughts might naturally turn from the solitary focus on the task at hand, the field, the hearth, the mending, to the presence, or perhaps more keenly, the absence of other human souls in this vast, often silent expanse. For some honey particularly, if your imagined life has placed you in one of the small burgeoning settlements that dotted the frontier, or perhaps a slightly more established agricultural community, or a raw mining camp, the end of. The workday might bring with it a degree of social interaction, a welcome shift from solitary effort to shared existence. Neighbors, who in this context were often far more than just people, living in geographical proximity, but rather essential partners in the grand, challenging enterprise of survival, might exchange a few tired but friendly words over a roughly hewn fence line as you both call in your livestock for the evening. You might hear the distant, comforting sound of a neighbor's voice, calling to their children, or the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer finally falling silent as he closes up his small hang-smoky shop for the day. Perhaps there's a communal well where you might encounter others, drawing water for the evening meal, a brief opportunity to share a piece of news, a worry, or a simple pleasantry. The importance of these neighbors, these connections, however tenuous they might seem by modern standards, cannot be overstated. They were the ones you might turn to in times of sudden sickness or injury, the ones whose strong arms you would rely on for help with a task too large for one person or one family alone, like raising the heavy timber frame of a new barn or bringing in a particularly difficult harvest before a threatening storm broke. There was often a strong and unspoken current of mutual aid, an intrinsic understanding that individual survival was deeply intertwined with the well-being and cooperation of the community, however small or scattered it might be. Churches, too, where they managed to become established amidst the raw newness of these settlements, often served as far more than just places of worship. They were vital social centers, gathering points where people from isolated homesteads might convene, not only for spiritual solace but also for human connection. Imagine the simple, though perhaps unadorned interior of such a building, maybe a log structure or a plain clapboard hall. You might hear the shared, slightly hesitant notes of a familiar hymn being sung by a small congregation, the combined voices rising with a mixture of reverence and quiet fellowship, the sound carrying on the still evening air, a beacon of shared faith and a reminder of shared humanity in a sometimes lonely world. These gatherings were where news from back east or other settlements was exchanged, where comfort was offered in times of grief, and where a fragile sense of community was painstakingly forged and carefully nurtured. There was a certain irreplaceable warmth to be found in these fleeting connections, the genuine feeling of reassurance that came from a shared, understanding glance. Across a room, the simple offer of a helping hand with a difficult task or just the quiet, profound comfort of knowing that you were not entirely alone in facing the myriad struggles of this demanding life. However, for many others, particularly those who found themselves on isolated homesteads, staked out miles from the nearest neighbor, scattered like tiny solitary islands across the immense prairies or tucked away in remote, silent mountain valleys, the waning of the day would only serve to deepen and intensify the sense of profound isolation. Imagine, if you will, standing outside your solitary cabin as the last brilliant sliver of the sun finally disappears below the western horizon. The silence that descends then might be vast, almost tangible, an echoing emptiness, broken only by the ceaseless mournful sigh of the wind as it sweeps unimpeded across the open plains, your only constant, invisible companion. Or perhaps the only sound is the lonely, piercing cry of a distant animal, a coyote's mournful yelp, the haunting hoot of an owl beginning its nightly hunt. In every direction you look, the landscape stretches away into the gathering gloom, empty of human habitation, devoid of any welcoming light, as far as your eye can possibly see. Days, even weeks, could realistically pass without you seeing another human soul. Outside your own immediate family, if you had one with you. The psychological toll of such profound and prolonged solitude could be immense, a heavy unseen weight pressing down on your spirit. You might feel a deep, unspoken, almost aching longing for simple conversation with someone new, for the sight of a different human face, for the simple, reassuring comfort of knowing that there were other people, other lives, unfolding within easy reach. This profound quiet, this immense unpeopled space could be both breathtakingly awe-inspiring in its raw, natural grandeur, and at the same time, deeply, almost unbearably, lonely. The chill of this solitude could sometimes feel as penetrating and as real as the rapidly cooling evening air itself. And what of law and order in these often far-flung and sparsely populated territories? For much of this period, especially in the newer, less established areas, formal law enforcement, a sheriff, a marshal, a local constable, was scarce and spread incredibly thin across vast geographical areas, or in many remote places, entirely non-existent. A county sheriff, for instance, might be theoretically responsible for an area larger than some entire eastern states today, with perhaps only one or two deputies, if any at all. His ability to respond to trouble or a call for help in a distant, isolated corner of his sprawling jurisdiction was severely limited, often meaning a delay of days, if he could be reached at all. This practical absence of a readily available legal structure meant that many disputes over land claims, water rights, straying livestock, or personal grievances were often settled personally between the individuals involved, or perhaps through some form of informal community agreement or pressure, if a community even existed. While the Wild West wasn't necessarily the constant scene of dramatic gunfights and unchecked mayhem, that popular culture often delights in portraying the lack of a reliable, impartial, and swift legal recourse did create a certain pervasive feeling of vulnerability, an underlying quiet unease. You might feel a subtle and persistent prickle of anxiety, knowing that if serious trouble did arise, perhaps a dispute with a belligerent neighbor that escalated, or the rare but deeply feared appearance of opportunistic outlaws or desperate drifters, help from any formal authority, was very far away, and you were largely, if not entirely or reliant on your own resources, your own courage, or the solidarity of your immediate neighbors, if you had any view for your own protection and the safety of your property. This wasn't necessarily a constant, overt fear that dominated every waking moment, but rather a quiet, ever-present awareness of your own ultimate responsibility for your safety and security, a feeling quite different from the bedrock expectation of readily available police protection and a functioning justice system that many of us have today. For many, the quiet evening hours were also a time for practical crafts that, while still serving a purpose, could also be somewhat meditative and offer a different kind of focus than the heavy labor of the day. Women might engage in mending clothes by the dim light, patching worn trousers or darning socks, with a rhythmic, steady movement of the needle, their fingers deft and practiced. Or perhaps it was quilting, a task that could be both solitary and communal. Alone, a woman might piece together scraps of fabric, remnants from old dresses or shirts, into intricate, beautiful patterns, each stitch a small act of creation. If neighbors gathered for a quilting bee, it became a lively social occasion, filled with chatter and shared stories as busy hands worked together to create something both useful and beautiful. You can imagine the sight of those focused expressions, the quiet snip of scissors, the soft, repetitive pull of thread through fabric. Men, too, would often have their own quiet evening pursuits. They might spend time whittling a piece of soft wood with a sharp knife, skillfully shaping it into a useful tool handle, a child's simple toy like a carved animal or a spinning top, or simply a pleasing, smooth form that felt good in the hand, the rhythmic, scraping sound of the knife against the wood. The sight of the fragrant shavings accumulating at their feet could be a strangely soothing activity, and sometimes the quiet scratch of a pen on paper might be heard if someone was painstakingly composing a letter to far-off family, each word chosen with care a precious link to a distant world. And always, if a fire was still burning low in the hearth, its gentle crackle and pop would provide both a little light and a comforting central sound in the otherwise quiet room, a focal point for tired eyes and weary minds. Community gatherings, though often infrequent due to the distances and difficulties of travel, were true highlights of social life, eagerly anticipated and long remembered with fondness. A barn raising, where neighbors from miles around came together to help a newcomer erect the heavy timber frame of their barn, was a remarkable display of shared labor and communal spirit, almost always followed by a celebratory fiaki with tables groaning under the weight of contributed dishes and perhaps some lively fiddle music and energetic dancing that went on late into the night. Quilting bees, as mentioned, brought women together for companionship and shared creativity. Church socials, box suppers where young women would prepare a decorated box lunch to be bid on by eligible bachelors, or holiday celebrations, like Christmas or the 4th of July, were cherished occasions for dressing in your best. We were sharing food, catching up on all the local news, and for the younger folk, perhaps a rare and exciting chance for a bit of shy or supervised courtship. These events, however simple by our standards, provided a vital sense of belonging, a powerful reminder that even in the vastness and isolation of the frontier, human connection could be found, nurtured, and deeply cherished. The warmth of shared company, the sound of laughter, the taste of special once-a-year treats, these were sensory memories to be savored. For children on the frontier, leisure was also remarkably simple and often intertwined with their daily chores, which began at a very young age. Their toys were frequently homemade, born of ingenuity and whatever materials were at hand. A doll meticulously crafted from scraps of cloth and perhaps stuffed with dried corn husks, a roughly carved wooden animal, a simple ball made from wound string or a stuffed animal bladder. They would play games that required immense imagination, rather than elaborate or expensive equipment. Games of make-believe, mimicking the adult activities they saw around them, or simple running and chasing games in the open spaces, if such spaces were safe. Their days were not filled with structured activities or electronic distractions. Their entertainment came from the natural world, from their own creativity, and from the stories and songs shared by their elders. Now, try to imagine yourself, truly, trying to fill your own evening hours in such a context, particularly after a day of profound physical exhaustion that has left every muscle in your body aching. There are no glowing screens of televisions, computers, or smartphones to capture your attention and effortlessly fill the quiet hours. There is no endless stream of music or podcasts available at your fingertips, no internet to browse for information or connection. The light is dim at casting long and in flickering shadows. Your body aches with a weariness that sleep itself might only partially alleviate. The world outside, you're small and often isolated. Shelter is dark, vast and profoundly quiet, save for the sounds of nature. How would you cope? How would you find solace or stimulation? or simple peace in such profound simplicity, such an absence of external distraction. The contrast with our modern, sensory-rich, constantly connected evenings is almost impossible to fully grasp, and it highlights yet another layer of the immense adjustment and perhaps the quiet strength required for life in that bygone era. You might lie on your rough bed, listening intently to the symphony of the wilderness night, every nerve perhaps a little more on edge than during the daylight hours. The distinct drop in temperature as the night deepened would also make itself known. You would feel the chill seep into the cabin, a cold that felt different, more penetrating than the daytime cold. It would encourage you to draw your blankets, perhaps a heavy wool quilt or a crudely tanned animal hide, tighter around you, or if you were part of a family, perhaps to huddle closer together for shared warmth, finding a small measure of comfort and security in physical closeness. You might feel a prickling sensation of unease on your skin, a heightened awareness that came with being awake and watchful in the deep, silent, and very dark heart of the night. Sleep, when it finally came, might be light, easily disturbed by any unusual sound, your mind always holding a small part of itself in reserve, listening, waiting, until the first, faint and ever so welcome promise of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. This heightened awareness, this sense of being a small flicker of light, a fragile human presence in a vast and sometimes dangerous darkness, was amplified by the very nature of the wild in this historical West. The darkness held not just the unknown, but also the known and often unseen inhabitants of these wild lands, creatures of the night, the ever-present forces of nature, and sometimes other people, all contributing to the persistent, underlying sense that your small homestead, your fragile human endeavor, was indeed an outpost in a world not entirely tamed, a world that operated by its own ancient and often unforgiving rules. Wildlife, for instance, was an undeniable and constant part of this frontier experience, while not necessarily a source of constant and dramatic threat for every person, every single day. The awareness of its presence, often unseen, was always there, a subtle undercurrent to your daily life and especially to your nights. As you lay in the darkness or perhaps moved quietly about your cabin in the dim light of a dying fire, you might hear the sudden sharp hiss of a snake that had sought warmth unseen in the tall grass near your dwelling. Sounds that would make your heart momentarily leap into your throat. Or perhaps it was the distant, haunting howl of a wolf pack, a sound that could seem to drift closer and closer on the still night air, carrying with it a primal chill, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. You might hear the startling rustle of a larger animal moving nearby in the darkness, a bear perhaps, or a mountain lion, depending on your specific location, a sound that would certainly send a shiver of primal fear through you, even if the creature passed by without incident. More often, it might be the less overtly threatening, though still sometimes unsettling, sounds of coyotes yipping and calling to each other in a complex, eerie chorus, or the sudden, soft hoot of an owl from a nearby tree. A reminder of the unseen life that thrived and hunted under the cloak of night. You might only catch fleeting glimpses of these creatures, dark shadows moving silently at the very edge of your limited lamplight, or the brief, unnerving glint of eyes reflecting back at you from the deep darkness just beyond your door. And then, there was the human element within this vast wild landscape. For settlers moving into these territories, especially those establishing isolated homesteads, the possibility of encounters with indigenous peoples was a complex and often deeply fraught part of their perceived reality. It is so important to approach this topic with great care and with a deep sense of empathy, understanding that this was a period of profound upheaval, of clashing cultures, and of tragic conflict over land and ways of life. viewed very differently by all involved. From the perspective of a solitary settler or a small, isolated family, often arriving with preconceived notions and fears, the appearance of indigenous individuals whose customs, languages, and immediate intentions might be entirely unknown and therefore unsettling to them, could certainly be a source of profound apprehension and uncertainty. The historical context, as you know, was one of increasing tension and displacement. While it is true that many encounters between settlers and indigenous people were peaceful and some even involved elements of trade or cautious, temporary coexistence, the settlers' fear of potential conflict, the dread of a possible raid, or simply the deep, gnawing anxiety of not knowing what to expect from those whose land this had been for generations, was a genuine and often palpable undercurrent to their daily existence. This wasn't always about a specific immediate act of aggression, but more about that unsettling feeling of being in a contested and poorly understood land, where the rules of engagement were often unclear and seemed to be ever-shifting. This added another layer of the unknown, another potential peril that contributed to the feeling of vulnerability, especially at night or when far from the perceived safety of a larger, more established settlement. Beyond the living inhabitants, the very nature of the frontier was its profound and often dangerous unpredictability, especially concerning the raw power of the elements. Sudden, violent storms could sweep across the plains or roar through the mountains with astonishingly little warning. You might see the western sky turn, a bruised dark and angry green-black, a terrifying harbinger of an approaching thunderstorm or a tornado. Then you would hear the deafening roar of the wind as it buffeted your small cabin, threatening to tear the roof from its moorings, followed by the sharp and explosive crack of thunder that sounded as if it were right on your doorstep, and the relentless, deafening drumming of heavy rain or destructive hail against your fragile shelter. Prairie fires, especially during the dry season, when the tall grasses were cured to a tinder-like state, were a particularly terrifying and fast-moving danger, capable of consuming everything in their path with horrifying speed and an all-consuming roar. Imagine seeing the angry orange glow of an approaching fire on the distant horizon at night, smelling the acrid choking scent of smoke growing stronger with every passing minute and feeling a surge of sheer panic as you realized the wall of flames was heading your way, threatening your home, your livestock, your very life. Even unexpected visitors in such isolated circumstances could be a source of both potential relief, perhaps they brought news or needed aid, and a degree of apprehension. Were they friendly travelers simply seeking shelter for the night? Or could they be someone with less honorable intentions? You would have to make a quick, crucial judgment, often with very little information to guide you. This constant need for vigilance, for adaptability, for being prepared, as best you could for the utterly unexpected, was a fundamental and exhausting aspect of survival in this untamed world. And so, your imagined day, filled with unceasing effort, with quiet anxieties both seen and unseen, and with those small, hard-won moments of simple existence, now draws almost to its inevitable close, as the deepest part of the night settles around you, bringing with it its own unique blend of quietude and subtle tension. It's time for us to step back, to reflect on this journey through the demanding landscape of the past. And so, our immersive day in those untamed lands of the past comes to a quiet close, as the imagined darkness enfolds that historical world and your imagined self, weary from the unceasing efforts and the quiet anxieties we've journeyed through together, finally seeks rest. Let's gently gather the threads of what we've encountered on this shared exploration. We have walked in our minds, from the first often biting light of a frontier dawn through the relentless, sun-drenched or wind-swept toil of midday, and into the deep and uncertain shadows of the encroaching night. Remember now, just for a moment, the sting of that biting wind we imagined at dawn, the feel of rough-hewn wood or cold, damp earth that might have formed your shelter. Recall the simple, perhaps meager taste of hard-won rations, the pervasive scent of wood smoke, and the vast, profound silence of the plains stretching out under a canopy of brilliant, seemingly indifferent stars. These small sensory threads, these imagined feelings and fleeting images, weave together the fabric of that bygone existence, an existence so fundamentally, so starkly different from our own modern lives. What we have touched, as we've moved through this hypothetical day, is the inescapable realization that for those who lived in that era, in those often unforgiving places, survival was not an occasional dramatic adventure, nor a thrilling tale to be recounted with bravado later. It was, instead, an arduous, unyielding, and often monotonous daily task. There was a profound and almost unimaginable lack of the safety nets that we so often take for granted today. No readily available, scientifically advanced medical care to mend a grievously broken bone or cure a raging infectious fever. Few, if any, organized social services to catch you if you fell into dire straits through misfortune or illness, and certainly no easy, ubiquitous access to essential resources like clean water, abundant food, or secure climate-controlled shelter. The sheer physical and mental fortitude required to simply navigate each day, to face the extremes of the environment, to engage in back-breaking labor from sunup to sundown, to tend to sickness and injury with such limited and often ineffective means, and to endure the profound, soul-deep isolation that many experienced, is almost beyond our modern comprehension. The chasm between their then and our now is indeed immense, measured not just in the passage of years, but in the very texture and fundamental assumptions of daily life, in the baseline of effort required simply to continue, to endure, understanding these stark realities, acknowledging this immense chasm between their daily lives and our own. What enduring feelings or thoughts does this shared journey leave with us as we rest here, in our own time, surrounded by comforts they could scarcely have dreamed of, beyond the mere recounting of hardships, of dangers faced and discomforts endured? There's a deeper human story here, isn't there? There's a resonance, a quiet echo that touches us across the intervening years, inviting not judgment for what they lacked by our standards, nor pity that might inadvertently diminish their strength, but rather a quiet, profound and deeply felt understanding. It's an invitation, perhaps, to cultivate a gentle, a more conscious appreciation for the myriad comforts, conveniences, and securities that envelop our own daily lives, often so seamlessly, so effortlessly, that we barely register their constant supportive presence. Feel this just for a moment, the deep, almost unconscious comfort of your own surroundings. Now, the effortless warmth or coolness of the air that you breathe, the readily available as clean light that banishes all shadows at the flick of a switch, the quiet, steadfast security of your home, the profound assurance that nourishing food and fresh, clean water are easily and readily within your reach. And as you hold that feeling of present comfort, perhaps you can hold it gently alongside the empathy we've sought to cultivate tonight for those who knew. So few of these fundamental assurances for those whose daily existence was an unceasing testament to human resilience, to an almost unbelievable capacity to endure in the face of unyielding, often brutal challenges. This journey is not about feeling a sense of superiority over the past, for that would be a profound misreading of history and the human spirit. It is, in rather, about fostering a deeper, more compassionate empathy for the people who inhabited that world, people with the same fundamental human hopes, the same deep-seated fears, the same desires for love, for family, for a measure of peace and happiness as our own. They loved their children. They sought moments of joy and companionship. They dreamed of a better future, and they faced their often overwhelming struggles with a strength and a quiet courage that we can now only try to humbly imagine. Understanding their world, even in this gentle yet reflective way, doesn't diminish our own experiences or challenges. Instead, it can enrich our perspective, adding layers of depth and context to our understanding of the broader human journey. It reminds us quite powerfully of how far we have come in so many ways, and of the quiet, often uncelebrated, everyday courage that is woven into the very fabric of our shared human story. Their resilience in the face of such daily adversity, their ability to find moments of community, solace, and simple pleasure amidst the relentless toil and uncertainty, speaks volumes about the enduring, adaptable, and often inspiring nature of the human spirit. And in recognizing their full humanity, their complex struggles, and their quiet strengths, we invariably connect with something fundamental, something timeless within ourselves. May these reflections settle gently within you now, bringing with them not a sense of sadness for what was, but rather a feeling of calm connection, of shared humanity, and perhaps a quiet, profound peace as our time together winds down for tonight, as the story of this imagined day on the frontier gently fades into the quiet of your own present moment. Carry this gentle understanding with you. The stories of the past, even those that speak of hardship and profound challenge, can paradoxically bring a quiet comfort, a unique perspective to our own lives. They remind us of the remarkable strength that lies within the human spirit, of our collective capacity for endurance and adaptation, and perhaps most importantly, of the profound preciousness of the peace, the security, and the myriad small comforts that many of us are fortunate enough to experience each and every day. Our aim this evening was not to overwhelm you with the harshness of a bygone era, nor to paint a picture of unremitting bleakness, but rather to walk softly through that world for a short while, to try and understand, with a measure of empathy, and perhaps in doing so, to find a deeper, more conscious appreciation for the quiet hums and the gentle rhythms of our own lives, for the simple, profound safety of our own nights. May the journey we've taken together this evening offer a sense of closure, a peaceful and thoughtful perspective as you prepare for rest or as you continue to relax. Let the echoes of the frontier, the wind across the plains, the crackle of the hearth fire fade now into a soft, encompassing, and deeply comforting silence. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey. May your thoughts be calm, your mind at ease, and your sleep, when it comes, be deep and untroubled. Until next time, rest well.